if it turns out that you're right, once the mania subsides, and for example, it turns out that lockdowns were a catastrophe and actually did not save anybody's lives, the people who said that, we're not getting any credit. You could make a case that it is to your evolutionary advantage to be a conformist, because people who rock the boat and who say things that are contrary to the shibboleths of their time pay a terrible price. I've never been able to exactly put my finger on it, what it is about certain people who simply don't get swept up in this stuff. Funnily enough, once you start thinking for yourself, it gets to be a habit. One of the most promising things about this whole woke period is the number of people who have distinguished themselves by sticking their necks out, often to their professional disadvantage. Because it doesn't matter whether you're any good at something. That is not valued. They don't value that. And they don't even really value fairness, as discussed. Yes, I have lost friends over politics. And I think it's pretty reliably the case in all such fallings out that it's the friend to the left that walks out on the friend to the right. There comes a point that there is no neutrality. When something larger in society that's going on that is basically warped, at a certain point everyone has to take a stand. And you can't just say, leave me alone.
Hello and welcome to The Current with me, Nick Dixon. And today we are honoured to have as our guest the author of many excellent books, including We Need to Talk About Kevin, The Mandibles, and most recently Mania, which we'll be discussing today, which I have here. It is, of course, writer and commentator Lionel Shriver. Thanks so much for doing the show, Lionel.
I look forward to talking to you.
Well, we're honoured to have you, but let me just ask first. So I've been reading this book. It's an excellent book, and it's a novel, of course. And the premise is stated here on the cover. What if calling someone stupid was illegal? Good premise. It works very well in the book as a kind of central metaphor. What I was wondering, though, so the whole idea is that IQ becomes taboo and you can't call anyone stupid. And, of course, it is a metaphor and a kind of central premise for this kind of dystopian or satirical novel. But also IQ is literally taboo. I mean, if a scientific study tries to say anything about groups of people and IQs, people get in a lot of trouble. We had rumblings in the last few years about the sort of cognitive elite, the kind of tech billionaires. So there's also that aspect, but it also works as a metaphor for kind of wokeness and so on. So I'm just wondering how you chose that premise and how you knew that would work as a kind of central metaphor for the book.
Well, in a lot of ways, claiming that there's no such thing as variable human intelligence, and we're all equally smart, and therefore you can't discriminate against people on the basis of intelligence if we're all the same. It's where we're going. This is just right next door to what the left would envision for our future. They're obsessed with sameness, with equality, and now it's equity. Okay, so I think the left really likes to think of people as all fundamentally the same. And they're very uncomfortable with the unfairness even of nature, because the nature distributes talents unevenly, and that's not fair, right? So it's unjust that there are some people who are incredibly bright and there are other people who are pig thick. So they're obsessed with leveling. And I for one have no problem with a world in which people are very different and have different talents and get different outcomes, because some people work hard, some people have more on the ball, some people are more gifted at whatever they pursue. And there is a justice in that variability, because one of the things that it measures is effort, right? But even on the effort thing, the left is uncomfortable. They want everyone to turn out as the same little widgets. And there's a short story by Kurt Vonnegut called Harrison Bergeron, I've been accused of copying it, which is absurd. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with it. It's the premise is that everyone has to be the same, and therefore anyone who is especially gifted at anything has to be handicapped. And so, if you are very smart, then you have to wear earphones that are constantly making loud noises to interrupt your thoughts. If you're very graceful, you have to wear weights that make you clunky. This would pertain to any kind of gift. Now, that's not what happens in my novel, and I don't think we can say that like a 6 or 7 page short story by Kurt Vonnegut in the 1960s is the be-all and end-all of making a comment on this obsession with everyone being the same. But it's a kind of touchstone. That's the story that people always remember. And it's one of the things that's striking about that story is that most people don't remember short stories, and yet anyone who's read that book always remembers that story.
Right, yeah, because it must be a really strong premise. But on that, I really wanted to ask you about the egalitarianism. So, yeah, the kind of denial of difference and IQ, it seems like the apotheosis of egalitarianism, you could say. And there is that inherent tension in liberalism between freedom and equality. And it kind of seems to me like the neoliberal culture has kind of just chosen equality and, forsaken the freedom. And if you are not against, but not too worried, as you say, about equality, that kind of puts you on the right. That's the kind of fundamental distinction. I don't know where you see yourself, if you see yourself as a liberal or what, but is that the inevitable logic of the liberal culture we're in, that it tends towards this absurd equity, or is it a kind of perversion of classical liberal values with something else?
It's definitely a perversion. But one of the perversions is to, first off, to define justice so narrowly, and I think artificially, so that, this whole idea of equality of outcome, well, that's not real justice, as I just described. Someone really, someone spends, 9 or 10 years becoming qualified as a surgeon, they deserve to be rewarded with a considerable salary, and also, is willing to go into a field where the risks are very high, that if you fail, then the consequences are enormous and morally catastrophic. So that there should be a reward for that also. And that would be my version of justice. But the left's current version of justice is merely to invert everything, so that if there's ever any kind of perceived disadvantage, means that you have to be advantaged. And, there's a crudeness to that. There's a moral simplicity and an injustice. Lots of members of these groups don't deserve to be lifted up. They have not distinguished themselves. And obviously, rating people in accordance with their membership of racial groups or sexual preference groups, there's an injustice in that. It doesn't end up with fairness. It's just a new kind of injustice in my book.
I mean, how far was this when you talk about, obviously it's called Mania, and obviously the book was, I assume, influenced by various manias that we've had. We've had woke in general, more specifically the trans movement, COVID, one could go on. So it's sort of commented on woke inherently because woke is a sort of cult of low IQ. It asks us to believe in obvious falsehoods. It asks us to not apply our critical thinking. One irony of the book, which our mutual friend Toby Young has pointed out, annoyingly, is a good point he made, which is you have to be very smart to navigate the world of woke. And this comes up in your book a few times. And one great example is in the class where your narrator is in a sort of re-education class, and it's very complicated, the kind of language you have to use, and the teacher is, maybe I can even get it, the person leading the class is using incredibly complicated language to explain words that you can't say anymore. And one of them was any elevation of one person's intellectual powers is necessarily a derogation of someone else's. If there's no implied comparison, a pejorative comparison, the compliment is meaningless. Just a sense like that. You think these people are complicated language games that Toby pointed out. Ironically, they wanted to care about, let's say, autistic people or mental health and so on. Autistic people are excluded from this because they can't understand the social nuance. And elsewhere, you talk about the anti-intelligence intelligentsia. So what is going on here? It seems like these kind of things are a game whereby intelligent people, the expert class and so on, in Woke or in your book, are pretending to be stupid.
Yes, I make the point in the book that some of the first people to jump on the so-called mental parity wagon are very smart, and at academics, for example, at prestigious and very intellectual professions, and that doesn't seem to make sense, because why would this be in their interest? But in their intelligence, they spot that this is the new thing, and therefore this is how they're going to claim status. And of course, this is the woke world, that very bright people pick up that if you banner these particular opinions, you will accrue status and admiration. And this is, even though this movement is anti-intellectual, it is still a means of climbing the social hierarchy. And smart people are very alert to new methods by which to distinguish themselves and to get one over on other people.
Yeah. So it's all about, yes, they use it, well, especially the friend character in the book uses it just to her career advantage, and that's seen as pragmatic and smart, whereas the narrator is much more, just wants to tell the truth for the sake of it, no matter what punishments in society that leads to. So yeah, it's sold as pragmatism.
Yes, and I'm illustrating what I actually did a column in The Spectator about recently, which is to say that when you turn out, when you're one of the people who says, listen, this is stupid, this is irrational, this is contrary to reality, this is destructive. If the rest of the society is going along with whatever mania, it's not in your interest. It's actually self-destructive. And if it turns out that you're right, once the mania subsides, and for example, it turns out that lockdowns were a catastrophe and actually did not save anybody's lives, the people who said that, we're not getting any credit. We're not getting any benefit from that. And I think that's very interesting. In fact, I advanced the theory in that column, which is actually taking off from a single line in the book, which is that you could make a case that it is to your evolutionary advantage to be a conformist, because people who rock the boat and who say things that are contrary to the shibboleths of their time pay a terrible price. And sometimes when the mania is fierce enough, they pay with their lives, or they end up in prison. And I gave the example of Galileo, who wasn't fully and completely exonerated by the Catholic Church for over 300 years. And he was sentenced to life in prison for promoting this absurd idea that the earth revolves around the sun. So those of us who say that the earth revolves around the sun, when it's not popular to do so, or I would say at an evolutionary disadvantage. The chances of something really terrible happening to us go up.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, nonconformists are hated. It's almost a tautology to say so because, of course, they're different from everyone else. They would be. But presumably there's also some evolutionary reason, I'm just guessing, why they exist. Presumably it's dangerous for all of a group to say one thing. If it's wrong, you must need a few people to go, hang on, that could be wrong. I'm guessing. Who knows why nonconformists exist? What do you think it is? Do you have any theory why someone like you, for example, doesn't go along with, say, lockdowns or other manias and all these other people do?
Actually, I puzzle over this, and I've never been able to exactly put my finger on it. What it is about certain people who simply don't get swept up in this stuff, whatever it is, and and have a funny immunity, and therefore keep their heads about them, and are able to see clearly, and don't necessarily just start parroting, trans women or women because that's what you're supposed to say. I don't know what it is. Honestly, I don't know what it is. I think I've been like this since I was a kid. By the time I was 8 years old, I really didn't buy my parents' Presbyterianism, in spite of the fact that, I was put in Sunday school and dragged to church every Sunday. But I didn't accept it, and it goes, it's been the same ever since. I admit to having gone through a period in my adolescence, which was during the tail end of the 60s and 70s. I definitely caught the the flower power virus. Not so much of that kind of peace and love stuff as, I was very much against the Vietnam War. I don't feel apologetic about that. And therefore I was quite a loyal little liberal Democrat in my youth. And it took me a while into my young adulthood to start thinking for myself on a range of issues. For example, the welfare state. My parents would have been really big on the welfare state, and little by little, I thought, even my parents, they work very hard. They get huge amounts out of their professions, and yet they want to put poor people on the dole, and that's a bad life, even in their own terms. That opinion defies their understanding of what a good life is, and therefore it is implicitly condescending. But it took me a little while to get there. Funnily enough, once you start thinking for yourself, it gets to be a habit.
Yeah.
And and by the way, I don't want to pretend that I'm like messianically special, and I don't have any company. I have plenty of company. One of the most promising things about this whole woke period is the number of people who have distinguished themselves by sticking their necks out, often to their professional disadvantage, and have been willing to speak what they see as the truth. And those are our colleagues. And I'm proud to claim them as part of my group. It's a motley group, but it's full of some very smart people, and also people who have a sense of humor.
Yeah. Do you know what? That reminds me, well, a couple of things. One, the fact that you were sort of liberal back in the day. I think a lot of people have ended up here via a strange route. There's some cliche of whatever side we're on that it's supposed to be conservative, fusty people, but of course it's not. It's disaffected, artsy-fartsy people. I mean, I've read a load of postmodern literature and really into music and played guitar and done a decade of stand-up comedy. I've ended up doing whatever this is. And these are, not traditionally conservative people, but we've all ended up in this strange bracket of whatever they like to call us. The other thing I was going to
like Brendan O'Neill
right.
was a Marxist, right?
Yeah.
So there are any number of people who started out in quite liberal or left areas that and ended up in the, if you will, anti-woke camp.
Yeah. Though was something you said there also reminded me of a line from the book. Annoyingly, I can't find it now, even though I've made copious notes. I made too many notes. But it was that the narrator always suspected that oddballs and misfits clubbed together, but then she comes to doubt that that's actually true. So what was your take on that? Because you're saying the opposite now, that you actually like this group of oddballs, but the narrator does doubt that at one point in the book.
Well, that was pertaining particularly to school children. And I was maintaining that everyone thinks that the weirdos are always going to cling together and be attracted to each other. But that's not necessarily true, that in fact the socially maladjusted no-hopers are still going to get crushes on the captain of the football team.
Yeah.
And I think there is a truth to that. In other words, weirdos are still attracted to attractive people, to dazzling people, to people with charisma. They're going to be physically attracted to, pretty people or handsome people. So it's not, you're not necessarily going to be having a crush on the guy in the next desk who's as, well, to put it frankly, say as ugly as you are. And I'd stick by that observation, and I think it still pertains to adulthood, that there are certain almost universally attractive human traits, and just because you're a weirdo doesn't mean you're not going to be prone to be drawn to people who have those traits.
Yeah. That's another sort of aspect, the harsh reality of beauty, which we also try and overturn with the body positivity movement and so on. And that's kind of alluded to in the book, or at times, yeah, it's very similar to the IQ idea in the book. That's part of
the sameness thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's part of the left sameness thing. We're all the same. We're all equally beautiful. And it doesn't matter how much you weigh. And of course, this one is especially absurd because judgments of beauty are very, very subjective and internal, and you can't actually impose this on people. It doesn't work. So you can tell me over and over again that people who are fantastically overweight are beautiful. It's not going to work. It's not going to make me want to fuck them.
Exactly, yeah. And you sort of get the Lizzo phenomenon. We all have to say, "Oh, it's amazing and you're beautiful," and no one actually thinks it. Is the funny thing. And although that's a good question, how far do people actually believe this stuff? And once you get rid of sort of what would be the word, intrinsically true standards of beauty, you sort of unravel everything. You unravel any kind of idea of a universal morality or an inherent beauty. So you end up in a different. The way I see it is, you've got the Roger Scruton side. He had a documentary called "Why Beauty Matters," I think it was. Then you had the Shock of the New, which was a documentary series about modern art. I always sort of put those two against each other in my mind as on one side we believe in inherent beauty and it's something to aspire to, and it's quite hard to get there. It's hard work. In the arts, it was hard to create incredible things. Michelangelo labored over these sculptures and so on, whatever example we cite. On the other side is the idea that there's no such thing as inherent beauty. It's all subjective. So therefore art becomes all about just shock value, for example. So that's a fundamental distinction as well, isn't it? The idea that there is such a thing as real objective truth and objective beauty.
Well, I think that the left resents a quality like beauty, and that's because it doesn't have moral qualities. I mean, we can identify beauty as a quality that we admire and aspire to, but it really isn't connected to good or bad in a moral sense. It can be more beautiful or less beautiful, but it isn't about, how we're treating each other, and it's not subject to that kind of judgment. And, one of the things I dislike about this period of time more than anything is that everything has to do with moral judgment, with virtue or evil, and that's a very flat way of looking at the world. And having grown up in a religious household, I find it oppressive, and it makes for a very small world, a small, judgmental, humorless, tight world. And that's not the world I want to live in. Humor is another thing the left doesn't like. Because whether something's funny doesn't have to do with whether or not it's good, right?
Right.
And so humor operates outside of the realm that the left is comfortable with. And by the way, this is new. When I was growing up, the left it celebrated chaos, anarchy, even a little badness, right? Mischief. And I think I've stayed in that version of the left. If that were still the way the left worked, that was also about, joy and taking drugs for the hell of it, and getting outside this, kind of churchy way of looking at things, then maybe I'd still consider myself of the left.
Yeah. It reminded me then when you were speaking of your fellow writer, Bret Easton Ellis, and people like that who are more concerned with the aesthetics of art than the sort of ameliorative function it's supposed to have now. Everything, as you say, has to be moral now, or has to be promoting the social program. And we see this all the time. As you say, comedy, which was ruined by the BBC in this country because they saw how popular it was. So like, okay, we're now going to make all the comedians diverse and woke and take this medium and completely ruin it and turn it into something else. Yeah, and the Gen X mentality was much more about, well, this is just good, this is interesting or funny or controversial, kind of Quentin Tarantino, Bret Easton Ellis. Now it all has to be right on, basically. And that's the death of art, really, I think.
Yeah, and also, this ethos that we're addressing is not interested in excellence, right? Excellence for its own sake. And all that matters is fairness. So fairness trumps excellence. And that's why they're so big on racial preferences and that sort of thing, because it doesn't matter whether you're any good at something. That is not valued. They don't value that. And they don't even really value fairness, as discussed, but they value the appearance of fairness. That's it. And also the joy in enforcing their version of fairness. So, it's as much about squelching white straight men as it is about elevating people who belong to minorities. It's all about an assertion of power, and that's always one of the attractions of joining the team, because you get to push other people around.
Yes, while claiming you're being moral, you get to act in an appalling way, as we see with cancel culture, which is still going on. And of course, I'm reminded of DEI there as well when you were speaking, because in the book, there's one funny example. It's not a spoiler, where someone works for NASA and they crash a spaceship because they were hired because they were not smart, because that's the current thing in the book. But that's very similar.
That's the idea, is that of course, ideologies don't stand still. They keep changing. And if they're not dying out, they're getting worse. And so what happens with this everyone is as smart as everyone else thing is that, in spite of the fact there's not supposed to be such a thing as dumb people, it turns into an affirmative action program for the promotion of dumb people, who are perceived to be stupid. And therefore, a bunch of idiots take over everything. Although in my book, a number of manias don't actually happen, because I said it in the recent past. The one mania that we still have in my book is lockdowns, because a bunch of idiots are in charge. And of course, that's how they address COVID.
Yeah. Yeah. I noticed that. Very funny. But and other things happen, but happen very differently. Like Brexit is 90% leave and so on because the Remainers are too offensively intellectual, or they call the leavers thick, basically. So that was a kind of satirical
Yeah.
note.
They say that, as the Remainers did, of course, during the referendum and afterwards, that everyone who voted leave was an idiot. And but in this mental parity movement time, that's unacceptable. That's bigoted, and so it completely backfires.
Yeah, be one way to get the win for Brexit. But yeah, I mean, and one other thing I haven't mentioned there, you sort of almost hinted at there, was that this very strange idea that these people are both oppressed and don't exist. And this is one of the contradictions in the book, and it very much reminds us of wokeness, particularly the trans movement. You know, trans women are just totally normal women, so just completely shouldn't even be talking about it, and yet they're special trans women who need special treatment. It's like, well, which one is it? And in the book, the sort of dumb people, they don't exist because we're all the same, and yet they must have special treatment. They also must be erased from the past. Everything controversial or even vaguely controversial in the past, and not even controversial, but anything to do with intelligence must be erased. And again, annoyingly, Toby made this point as well about wokeness, which is we're always saying we need to atone for our imperialist colonial past. At the same time, they're always trying to say, actually, it was always completely diverse. England was incredibly diverse since the very start. And, oh, look, maybe there was a trans soldier in Rome or whatever it is. And so there's, and very much in your book, it's at once these people are oppressed and they don't exist. And it's like, which is it?
Yeah, and you have to erase the past at the same time that you're constantly trying to make up for it, and that doesn't make any sense. And not only erase the past, but replace it with a new past, in which if that were true, then your movement wouldn't be necessary. Right?
Yeah. And they're very comfortable with these contradictions, aren't they? They just don't worry about it at all. Kind of reminds me of that Walt Whitman line, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. They're very comfortable just, yeah, this doesn't make sense, but so what? Shut up. That's basically the woke movement and the movement in your book. That wasn't a question. That was a statement.
Right now the alliance between the wokey left and the Palestinian cause is bizarre and doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. But that doesn't bother them either.
Yeah, queers for Palestine. One other thing I wanted to ask about in the book, the narrator falls out with a friend, and it reminded me very much of what happened in COVID to me, probably to you, to many of us. I mean, I fell out with someone I'd known for 10 years over masks. I didn't want to wear a mask. I thought it was stupid. And he said I deserved months of suffering because I deserved to get COVID. It's an incredible thing. I know, imagine that. You've known someone for 10 years and lived with them, and then they say that. Then we fell out over upper body strength because I said that men had higher upper body strength than women. And I forgot to say on average. And so he just called me an idiot a lot. I mean, as if, you say the sky is blue. It's like, oh, sometimes it's pink. It's like, obviously I mean average. But this was a kind of... Anyway, I fell out with that person. So did you fall out with people? And also, are we right to cut people off? Is there a point where we can... In the book, there's a moment where it's discussed that, oh, maybe we can still get on, and maybe that's a good example to the children to show that we can transcend ideological differences. But then there comes a point where that actually is impossible. So what's your take on that?
Yes, I have lost friends over politics. And I think it's pretty reliably the case in all such fallings out that it's the friend to the left that walks out on the friend to the right. I mean, that's just the case. And it's because this is a movement, insofar as it is a coherent movement, that values ideology above all other things. And therefore, ideology trumps personal loyalty or even family, right? And that's the case. That's a sign of a cult. That's what happened in Mao's China, that children denounced their own parents. All personal loyalty counted for nothing. similarly, in Stalin's time, you were expected to turn people in if they were ideological heretics, which people did. I mean, that's just the nature of an ideology that achieves a kind of totalitarian quorum in the society, and therefore all loyalty is to this way of thinking, and therefore you cast aside the people in your life whom you love, which is sick. Now, I don't want to be simplistic, and it is true that there's a point in a friendship in particular that if you differ on everything profoundly, you're probably going to grow apart a little bit. Or there's certainly going to be subjects you probably just can't talk about. And I have any number of friends who are much more left-wing than I am. And that's how we handle it for the most part. And all my friends in London were Remainers. And we went through a period of trying to understand what was wrong with me, that I supported Brexit. But then we put that subject aside and we simply didn't talk about it anymore. And that's not a bad solution. When you're not going to get anywhere, there are limits to your ability to understand each other, or even understanding each other doesn't advance your relationship at all. You're still going to be at loggerheads. You're not going to come to the same conclusion. So you just avoid that. I have to be pushed awfully far to disavow someone. And honestly, there are any number of people I've grown apart from for various reasons, but it's not for political reasons for the most part. It's either we don't live in the same city anymore, or there's something about that person who's always got on my nerves a little bit, like that. But I cannot think of ever having denounced a friendship because I thought this person's politics were immoral. And yet it has happened to me in reverse. And it's actually quite painful. I could be just indignant. But before I got to indignant, I was injured. And that experience is one of the things I tried to capture in this book. So it's not just a political satire. It is also a serious story of a friendship that goes back decades and is suddenly put under strain because of the different ways the two friends are dealing with the political moment.
Yeah, there's certainly friends of mine who've been through that. I mean, I've been through it, but friends more on the left who still hold to sort of the liberal left, and they're kind of stunned with the way their so-called friends have ostracized them. Someone like Andrew Doyle springs to mind. But yeah, that's, as you say, it's usually that way around. The person on the left leaves. The family one's particularly painful. I mean, even in my family, we had to agree, as you said, not to talk about politics at all. There was talk that I shouldn't come round at all at Christmas one year until my dad overruled it because it would just get too nasty if the subject of Trump came up. Not that you're a Trump fan, which we could get onto later, but we just couldn't even mention Trump. Certain members of my family go completely insane, or Brexit, basically any of these topics, and it got incredibly nasty. And I did wonder, with certain my family during COVID, I asked myself, would they put me in some sort of quarantine camp? I wasn't telling certain family members that I hadn't had the vaccine. They were asking me, have you got your booster? And I was thinking, it's so much worse than you think. I haven't even got the first one. So, I was like, I don't even trust certain members of my own family. And that's where it gets frightening. As you say, that's a Soviet thing. It's also very real. Just last night on GB News, we covered a story about an Edinburgh school. This is a private school charging 16 grand a year. And they reported the parents to social services because the parents questioned the school's blind obeisance to gender madness and the child using his own pronouns, whatever it was, and the parents were like, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" They reported the parents to social services. So this is going on now. It's a big theme of your book, parents actually being afraid of their own children because the children become assets of the ideology.
Yes, and in the book, my protagonist has a youngest child who is young enough that once the mental parity movement takes over, by the time she hits kindergarten, that it's firmly ensconced, and therefore she doesn't grow up with anything else. And as you say, basically becomes an asset for the state and reports her own mother to social services for using bigoted language like stupid at home. And she has a grudge because she is not as smart as her older two siblings. And so her way of getting status in the family is to become a tout.
Yeah, and that's kind of so often the way, incredibly disturbing. But I mean, the book made me very angry lots of times in a way that it's supposed to. I mean, the friend character, even the husband character, I'm just so angry with people who go along with this stuff, even people who want a quiet life and try and say, oh, just get along like the husband does. To me, I'm like, that makes me sick as well, personally. I can't deal with any. I mean, maybe you're the same.
Oh, that's exactly what that's what the partner Wade is meant to stand in for. He's a tree surgeon. This stuff shouldn't have anything to do with him. And he doesn't want to participate. He doesn't want to have to take a position of any kind. He just wants to get on with his life. And there are a lot of people like that. And of course, what ends up happening is because this movement spreads into qualification, a suspicion of or opposition to qualifications of any kind, so that he ends up having to hire another tree surgeon who doesn't know what he's doing and ends up suffering serious consequences. And that is by way of saying, there comes a point that there is no neutrality. When something larger in society that's going on that is basically warped, at a certain point, everyone has to take a stand, and you can't just say, leave me alone. And I think the woke stuff is getting serious enough and has spread into enough institutions that's close to where we are, that it's if you have any kids in school right now, in public schools, you're up against woke world, like it or not. And your kids are being indoctrinated with gender and critical race theory ideology. And you're going to have to step in and protect your children from destructive thinking.
Yeah, and even in private schools, I mean, as Andrew Doyle always points out, this is an elite movement, wokeness, so it's even there. And you're paying 15, 16 grand and you're going, they're learning this rubbish even here. And even in some of the Christian schools, yeah, it's everywhere, as you say, so you have to take a stand. But do you see woke ending? We see that DEI is reducing a little bit. We see the caste review, the gender madness is definitely changing in tone. So do you think woke will actually end soon? And what will be, in your guess, the next mania?
Well, we're in the middle of one right now. I mean, the climate alarmism is a mania. There's no question. One of the giveaways is how completely we are barred in the mainstream media from saying a discouraging word about climate ideology. It's just the truth. The science says so, and you're not going to find anyone sticking up for so-called denialism on the BBC. So yeah, we're in one already, and it's going to take a little while to defeat it. That will be defeated by reality, okay? Because net zero is impossible, and that's already becoming apparent. So, so yeah, the death of climate hysteria is imminent. As for the larger constellation of issues that we call woke, for lack of another word, they're not going away anytime soon, just because there are a lot of people's jobs that are dependent on this way of thinking. There is a huge cadre of employees that, and they're who are DEI people. And why should they give up their jobs? They won't without a fight. Big waste of money. And a big waste of money in government, big waste of money in corporations. And maybe if things get tight enough, they'll quietly sweep these people off. I have been really encouraged by what's been happening with the issue of transgenderism, a point on which I used to feel quite isolated, and now, now I have the sense of having colleagues, having company, and it's now possible to talk about this issue in a way that even 5 years ago it was not. Writing for The Spectator, whenever I have written about transgenderism, I can tell that the editor gets quietly terrified and goes over it with a fine-tooth comb. This would also apply to whenever I write about race. Now, I'll defend The Spectator. I don't get interfered with very much. My copy is very lightly edited. But I can feel the nervousness, even at The Spectator, on these red button issues. So, woke world will have collapsed when Fraser Nelson no longer gets hysterical when Lionel Shriver writes about race or gender issues.
No more editing, even not even a light edit, and that's when woke's ended. Just post. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm personally worried that the next one will be euthanasia. Not sure where you stand on it, but I see how hard they're pushing it. Starmer's obsessed with it. He's going to win a crushing majority. It's already being sold to us that you're uncaring, much like in COVID, you're uncaring scum if you don't want people to die, strangely. So because you don't care about the painful end of life situation, they say, and you're already a weirdo if you don't think euthanasia is a good idea. And if you see the horrible abuses in Canada, where you had a 41-year-old woman with fibromyalgia who secretly admitted she was just poor and wanted to die, and she was killed by the state. A man with autism who was just being bullied, also killed in Canada. 13,500 deaths in 2022. I've become a bit obsessed with it because this, I think, is the next thing. If you thought COVID was bad, it's going to be euthanizing people for increasingly tenuous reasons. Already happened in Canada. So that's what I think the next one will be. I don't know if you put that in the same category, but that would be my concern.
Well, I think that's definitely going to be a big issue. I wonder if it would qualify as a mania, in that I suspect that that's going to be a controversial matter, at least in the UK. It already is. And when a mania really takes hold, there is no opposition to speak of, except the few lone weirdos who get persecuted. I would expect that still to be contentious. And I would expect it still to be contentious in the United States also, because, there still is a religious faction which would raise objections to that as, as disrespectful of God and the sanctity of human life. Now, on that particular issue, I confess I'm torn. If I were terminally ill and in agony, and I have respect for what agony means, which basically means that making it second to second to second is horrible, right? It slows, extreme pain slows time down to almost perfect temporal paralysis. And I would like to have access to a way out. And sometimes when you grant people access to a way out, what happens is then because they know it's there, then they don't take it. So sometimes just the offer of there is a door you can take. So that can give you the courage to keep going. If courage is what's required, I'm not sure that's really what it is. Stubbornness, perhaps. So I like the idea of access to that, but I'm also very suspicious of the way in which these programs tend to spread, and the population who are being offered the door out of the building gets bigger and bigger, and starts including not just people who are terminally ill, but as you note in Canada, the people who have anorexia, or who are mentally ill, or just don't like being here anymore, who are depressed. It's it's creepy, and it's offering the state a means of getting rid of people who are expensive or inconvenient. And that's the point on which it really makes me anxious. I did a piece on this for Unheard, specifically about the Canadian program. And there are doctors who are pressuring expensive patients to please consider killing themselves to spare the healthcare system, which, in the UK would also be a danger. Let's not forget, save the NHS.
Save the NHS.
Right.
Our NHS. Yeah, exactly. So not quite a mania, as you say. Yeah, our NHS. It's not quite a mania, but it is something that the ruling elite is just pretending is a done deal, and why you even complain about it already, which is always their tactic, same in COVID and so on. But as you say, it's an ethical question, perhaps more than a mania. Before you go, in maybe the last few minutes, I notice people in your interviews don't tend to ask you about actual literature and fiction, which I care about, and read all these novels, have an MA in modern literature. So I wanted to know, were there any particular influences on this book? We've established not the Vonnegut short story. Lord of the Flies is mentioned in the book, but also Bonfire of the Vanities is mentioned, which is just a realist novel. So I wondered if there was a particular influence, and also who your favorite fiction writer is, living and dead. I'm just going to chuck that massive question there.
Well, I read a lot of science fiction when I was younger, in my teens, and I think it still influences me a little bit, so that this book is set in an alternative past, and then it ends in an alternative future. It ends in the latter 2020s. And I feel a relaxed access to speculative fiction and its devices. Although this is, this is not about technology. It's about sociology, really, about politics. But that would be a slight influence, that background of mine. I would say Orwell would have influenced it. It has amused me that calling something Orwellian lately has become such a cliche that we can't use it anymore. It's almost too obvious. But, I love 1984 and Brave New World. Brave New World also, because that's a very sociological / political book, more than about technology. It's both those books are basically about politics. I've always liked fiction that goes at issues or whatever, but are wrapped up in real people's lives and characters. And I'd rather read the way in which abstract questions entangle themselves in people's lives, and that in a way that isn't neat and isn't dry and isn't kind of out in the clouds. So in that sense, I just prefer fiction as a form to nonfiction. I read a lot of journalism, but I don't read a lot of nonfiction books. It's not human enough for me. In terms of the writers in general that I especially like, I love Graham Greene, also a writer who knew how to write about politics, although the people were always in the front. That it's more about people, but the politics are kind of in there. Also big on Richard Yates, who is no longer with us either, but he wrote Revolutionary Road. He was a cynic with a heart. And I like that. He saw people very clearly and what was wrong with them, and his characters are deeply flawed, but they're still a little bit heartbreaking. What is wrong with them is touching, and not a matter of just poking fun at them and thinking you're superior. And also his prose is great. For that matter, I was big on Faulkner when I was younger. I think I'd be a little impatient with him now because the language is so thick, and I have become I've started preferring somewhat simpler prose. I don't know. There's a smattering. Whenever anyone asks me what authors I especially admire, I can never remember anyone.
That's fair enough.
It sounds as if basically I'm illiterate.
No, I'm the same as you, except I haven't written about 20 great books. But I'm the same in that I prefer the philosophical novels, and it would have been better now for all these debates and to try and win on telly and on podcasts to have read a load of John Locke and stuff, and instead I've read Dostoevsky and all these people. That's what I prefer as well, the philosophical novel, the ideas, but in the form of actual stories. And and is there anyone? So you're not particularly. Is there anyone around now? There's you. I'm thinking about what novelists there really are around now. There's you. There's Welbeck, who wrote the brilliant Submission and many other books. There's Coates Zaya, who's still alive, who wrote the Disgrace, which is one of my favorite books. But there's not that many people around. Yeah, I've just written a piece on it on my Substack 3 times, and that actually predicts cancel culture, and I'd say the Me Too movement as well, and lots of other problems in South Africa as well. That was a very prescient book, I think, and there's some similarities with yours in the way that he goes to a tribunal and so on, an academic sort of struggle session. But also, I was going to ask you just quickly on that. It's a massive question, but just quickly, I mean, how do you decide? Because the novel is a form not really talked about much anymore. There's been the death of the novel for many years, but it's a form not really. It was a massive, important form in America, particularly. People were trying to write the great American novel, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, and so on, and it kind of, you don't really hear about that anymore. You have the occasional person like Jonathan Franzen trying to bring it back, but and obviously you're still writing novels. How do you decide? One, do you think the novel has any life in it? Obviously you do because you've just written one. But two, how do you decide if something is just a piece for the spectator or unheard versus an actual novel or fictional piece?
Well, on the death of the novel thing, it's true that we've been having that discussion for decades. But I do feel that the novel as a form is not as important as it used to be. That's what you meant. And actually feel personally less important as a consequence, if I'm going to be honest. When I'm writing a book now, I do not feel that that I'm necessarily writing something that very many people will read or that will make a big impact on the culture. I mean, I might have my hopes, but I certainly don't assume it. And I think right now, the novel is primarily a stepping stone to the Netflix series. And that's the only format that you're likely going to get to reach a large audience. It used to be that certain people wrote a novel and it was a big event, and Franzen is really the last of that. I'm not sure he deserves that status, but at least the intellectual, cultural powers that be have generally regarded when he publishes a book, it's a serious moment that, it demands to be addressed. But there's hardly anyone like that anymore. And I think people don't read book reviews anymore. And I say that as somebody who writes them. I don't read book reviews very much. So that's at least comforting when you get a bad one. Nobody's going to read it. Who cares? I can live with the form being less important as long as I'm reaching at least a small audience. If I'm dependent on Netflix entirely, that's kind of dismal because there's too much. There are too many television programs being produced right now. There's a glut, and therefore even the ones that get produced, a lot of them aren't getting watched. They get very small viewerships. So if I'm holding out hope that I will be important once again, because I get to Netflix, so that's kind of a crapshoot too. We're living in a time that audiences are incredibly fractured, and therefore, I guess if you have any audience, you're lucky, and therefore I am lucky. I mean, some people will read this book and good, that's great. It's better than just keeping it on my hard drive. And so far, the response to this book has been good. I mean, with the people that I care about, and then the people that I would have expected to hate it. All the right people hate it. The New York Times absolutely spittingly despised it.
Wow.
And obviously, if you feel that this book is aimed at you, not for you, but it's aimed at you, then you're going to bristle. And one of the things that's interesting about the people who hate it is they have led me to theorize that it is entirely possible to refuse to find something funny. Right? You can just sit there because to find something funny, you have to engage with it a little bit. And if you keep it enough of a stiff, hostile distance, any joke can fall flat. So, of course, these people have no sense of humor really, and therefore did not find the book funny. And that doesn't, maybe it's a testament to our polarization, but I just don't, I find I don't care. I know who these people are. They deserve each other. And you and I know which side we're on, and I know which crowd I'd rather have a drink with.
Well, that's definitely true. Yeah, it is a very funny book. I should have said that as well. These people, I always think I haven't read that New York Times response, but I'm going to have to read that now. Or maybe I shouldn't if you don't want me to. But it's
I don't care.
Okay, you don't care.
I find it amusing.
Because I just think that if they were a bit cooler, just at least pretend to sort of be like semi-balanced or maybe they don't have to love it, but they just got to, like with Andrew Dawes' books and so on, they just openly like, no, we reject, bad, and even like when Andrew does Tatiana McGrath or Tatiana McGrath, it's obviously like funny, it's if they can't even admit that, anyway, they're not cool. I mean, that's the point. The ideology is above all else. So yeah, not surprising.
Well, I mean, it is the nature of being one of those people who stuck my neck out. Is my political reputation precedes me, and therefore it's very obvious in the several hostile reviews that this book has got that what's getting reviewed first and foremost is my politics, right?
Right.
Whom I seem to support for president, and that I said these outrageous things about cultural appropriation and actually had the nerve to put a sombrero on my head. This is presented as proof that I'm evil incarnate, which I find highly comical. So these people discredit themselves from the get-go because they've already decided they hate me before they get to the book. And if you already hate the author and believe that author is evil incarnate, then your openness to the book is questionable.
Yeah, that is a good point. And by the way, it's Titania McGrath. Andrew will kill me for that. As in Midsummer Night's Dream, I might qualify for the one of the low IQ people in your book. But just before you go then, what I really want to know, since you touched on politics there, I listened to your podcast with Brendan O'Neill, was slightly disturbed to find that you still might vote Biden. Have you decided yet on that?
Well, I think I'm probably going to cheat. I'm registered in New York, and therefore, if I vote for a third party, then it won't have any effect on reality. That is, it's a foregone conclusion that New York's electoral votes are going Biden. It's just done deal. So I can do whatever I want, including not vote. If I could just not vote. But I have the luxury of voting for a kind of a third party as a protest vote. I mean, if RFK Jr. ends up running in New York, we'll see. Or I could just, I've done this before, like voting for the Libertarian Party, which is just stupid. You can call it a throwaway vote, but any vote other than for the Democrats in New York is a throwaway vote. So it doesn't matter. What that does not solve is what I would advise a voter in a swing state to vote. And in a swing state, it actually does matter which candidate you opt for. And a third party does have a spoiler quality, right? Usually hurting the very candidate you would most prefer. And it was interesting. I watched Eric Bogosian do squirm in the same hot seat very recently, pressed about which presidential candidate he would opt for. And he basically wouldn't say. He was in a state of perfect paralysis. And I'm still quite torn as to which future is darker for the United States, or for that matter, the rest of the world, of a Trump presidency or a Biden one. There are a lot of people who hate Trump, and most Democrats hate Trump so much that the idea of being torn would be foreign to them. But I am deeply unhappy with Biden. I think his net zero shenanigans are a danger to the country. He wants the entire electrical grid to be off fossil fuels by 2035, which is absurd. I mean, that's not much more than 10 years from now. I am enraged by the fact that he's still forgiving student debt when the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. I am worried about his spending, driving up the national debt even more. Of course, I'm worried about Trump's spending too. I mean, I have many of the same worries with both candidates. I'm worried about the projection of weakness internationally. I think, whatever the truth of the matter is, the appearance is that he is feeble, that he is growing demented, and that he is being manipulated by people behind the scenes. It's not a good look. It endangers the United States. And, I'm not going to go on about, on the other side, what's wrong with Trump, because it's so apparent. And I get so bored by Democrats going on and on about what a danger to democracy he is. I think it's a toss-up who's more of a danger to democracy. So, I mean, I we'll see what I say closer to the election, but I'm not declaring for either one of them right now.
Okay. Well, it's not my country, so it can always seem a bit rude for outsiders, but I'm always a bit surprised about the aversion to Trump at this point, because as you sort of satirically reference in your book, things are extremely unsafe under Biden. Whatever we think of Trump, the empirical evidence is we didn't have war in Ukraine, Russia, we didn't have Israel, Palestine, we didn't have the Afghanistan retreat. His deterrence, the fact that he might bomb Moscow or start a trade war with China seem to inhibit these countries from really doing what they want.
Yeah, it's a little harder for the Democrats to put over the same level of hysteria, although they do have January 6th and the fact that Trump did not participate really in a graceful transfer of power. So there's that, and I think that's, especially the latter, I think that's important.
Okay.
By the way, I want to correct one thing. I think I said Eric Bogosian, and I meant Peter Bogosian.
Oh yeah, because the playwright and actor.
I can't remember, my own name half the time. So.
Oh yeah, Peter Bogosian. Yeah, Eric Bogosian. He's an actor, isn't he? Yeah. I know the guy. But you mean Peter? Yeah. Okay, makes more sense. Okay. All right. Well, Well, I hope you change your mind, but because I just think Biden needs. I mean, talk about diversity hires and hiring dumb people. I mean, his press secretary could be out of your book. I mean, it's astonishing, but
Yeah, she's terrible. And actually a lot of the people on that team are subpar. One of the things that alarmed me about Biden from the very beginning was that as soon as he started making appointments on day one, all that he cared about was race or gender or what have you. It was all identity politics from the very beginning. And it was a bad sign. And I was right to be alarmed. Yeah.
And very reminiscent of your book, which everyone should get, Mania. There it is. And is there anywhere else? Don't literally go, please, because we lose the whole upload, as I said to you before. But for the purposes of the audience, we'll end it. So is there anywhere you'd like to direct people to?
Meaning to
what? your where can we find you, your articles, apart from your book, website, Twitter? Are you on X?
I don't have a website. I don't participate in social media. So just go to your local bookstore or Amazon and buy my book. And otherwise, I write a fortnightly column for The Spectator, which is one of the greatest magazines in the world, and not very expensive. So yes, that's how you communicate or follow me. It's pretty simple. I write occasionally for Unheard. I pop up in different places.
Okay. All right, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for doing the show, Lionel.
Oh, it's fun. I enjoyed talking to you.
All right, well, that was Lionel. Great episode, I thought. Hope you enjoyed it as well. If you want to support the podcast, go to nickdixon.net, which is my Substack, where you'll also get loads of content, like the full Carl Benjamin episode, which people are loving, the full Ben Habib episode. You can ask questions of upcoming guests, and you can get all my articles about the culture war and literature and all my personal problems. The last one's a joke. But go to nickdixon.net, which is my Substack. You can subscribe for £5 a month or 50 quid a year. Get all my podcast content, loads more planned in future, and all my writing. Or you can make a one-off donation at buymeacoffee.com/NickDixon. So buymeacoffee.com/NickDixon for a one-off donation, or just go to the Substack, nickdixon.net, and it's only £5 for all that good stuff. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.